AP17. This is the April 2019 QAS test, and let's jump in to solve it. 39 says, Burke refers to the repair of a building, lines 70 to 72, to make the point that something. So the way to solve this is let's go back up to the building that's mentioned in these lines here, and let's basically see what is the point of mentioning this. So here is Burke saying I would make the reparation as nearly as possible in the style of the building. So let's kind of get a general sense. Let's step back a little bit and understand the context here. So this is him, Burke, basically talking about the British Constitution, sort of praising it, talking about that we need to preserve it rather than to try to change it too much. He starts up here by saying I would not exclude alteration neither, meaning, yeah, it's okay to make changes to the government or to the Constitution, but he says even when I changed it, it would only be to preserve it, right? To change it to keep its original meaning. Then he said I should be led to my remedy by a great grievance. Basically, I'm going to be very cautious in the change that I make. And what I did, I would follow the example of our ancestors, right? And here's what the ancestors did. They would make the reparation as nearly as possible in the style of the building. So let's try to understand what that metaphor means. So he's basically saying any repair that I would make, I would try to keep it in the same style, right? So as if I'm repairing a building, instead of just bulldozing the building and rebuilding it, instead I would try to change, I would make repairs that were meant to bring the building back to its original style, sort of more restorative as opposed to adding new features or new things onto it that are different from what it originally was. My only task, my only reparation would be to repair it, would be to refurbish it, would be to restore it. So I'm going to keep it in the style of the building. So basically, if the question is asking, he refers to this repair to make the point that he's making is that basically it's important to not completely change something when you're repairing it, right? You should preserve the foundation or what's fundamental. So A says that governments need to be changed periodically to remain relevant. And this is sort of against the spirit of what Burke is arguing, which is basically that he's not wholesale against change, but he's cautious about change. So he's not making the case that every now and then, almost like on a schedule, you need to change government so they remain relevant. I think he thinks that if you have a strong foundation, it can exist in perpetuity. So I'd get rid of A. Then B basically says if a government has fundamental errors, it should be replaced. And maybe this is a point that Burke believes, like if a government is just messed up all the way to the core, instead of fixing it, you should just replace it. But that's not really a point that he makes. He doesn't talk about governments with fundamental errors. It goes against the spirit of what he's arguing, which is a little more moderate, a little more conservative about just making small repairs. So let's get rid of B. He's not saying anything should be replaced. C says that all governments have flaws that may be corrected with the proper intervention. So this is basically Burke saying that in his point, every government has a flaw, but you can fix these flaws. This might be true, that's something Burke believes, but really in the sentence that he's talking about the building, that's not the point that he's trying to make. He's not trying to talk about buildings to prove the point that every government has a flaw. This would be basically if he was like, look at any building looks really good, but when you look closely, you'll always find cracks. That might be more along the lines. So C is not right. D says that changes to a government should maintain that government's essential properties, and this really does match what we said about it, which is that any change that you make to a building, you want to keep in the same style, right? So he's using that metaphor to say that any change you make to a government, you should keep in the same style. Keep the essential properties, don't completely change it, just sort of make the repairs that you need to restore it back to what it was. So let's choose answer choice D for question 30.